Just then, Shola stirred in her sleep. She rolled over, draping an arm across his chest. Yun froze, his heart pounding. He gently tried to move her arm, but she instinctively returned to the same position. Resigned, he wrapped an arm around her and held her close. Shola loved her job. Working as a translator for a publishing company in Shanghai gave her access to countless amazing books, many of which hadn't been released yet. Today, she was handed a new manuscript to translate into English. The story was set in a fictional Chinese empire that aspired to become a global trade hub, forging connections with kingdoms from every continent, thereby increasing its wealth and influence. The emperor, after considerable effort, had successfully reached an agreement with an African kingdom, Kandari, which was abundant in resources. To solidify the treaty, the Kandari king sent the youngest of his 10 daughters, Princess Shola, to become a concubine of the crown prince, Long Chen. After marrying the crown prince, she was treated with disdain. Despite the cruelty, she fell in love with him and ultimately gave her life to save him from an assassination attempt. Only after her death did the crown prince realize the depth of his mistake and regret how he had treated her. But by then, it was too late. Shola hurled the book across the room of her home office. "What sort of ridiculous story is this?" she muttered. "The author must be nuts." What made it worse was that the female protagonist shared her name. She couldn't imagine translating such drivel. Having her name associated with this nonsense would ruin her reputation. Frustrated, she called her agent to request that the contract for the book be canceled. To her surprise, the agent told her that work on the book would be paused anyway. The author had been in a car accident the day before, and he was now in a coma. Shola's anger softened. She couldn't help but feel sorry for him and silently wished him a full recovery. Hanging up the phone, Shola glanced at the clock. Evening had crept up on her, and she realized she hadn't eaten much all day. Exhausted, she decided to grab a quick snack from the neighborhood grocery store. Still groggy and distracted, she stepped into the road without checking if the pedestrian light was green. A blaring honk jolted her senses, and she turned to see a truck barreling toward her at full speed. There was no time to react. The impact was swift, and everything went black. Shola opened her eyes slowly, bracing herself for what she expected to be unbearable pain. But she felt nothing. Confused, she concluded she must already be dead. Was this heaven? She sat up, taking in her unfamiliar surroundings. Her heart pounded as her gaze darted around the ornate walls. Where was she? A young woman dressed as a palace servant approached her bedside, her face lighting up with relief. "Princess Shola, you're awake!" she exclaimed. "You've had a fever for 3 days. The doctor said it was caused by homesickness." I was so worried. Shola stared at the woman, her shock rendering her momentarily speechless. "Princess Shola? That couldn't be right. Who are you? Where am I?" she managed to ask. The servant's smile faltered. "Oh no, princess. Let me fetch the imperial doctor." Shola quickly stopped her. "Wait, is your name Lin?" The woman's eyes widened. "Yes, princess. You're starting to remember." Shola's heart sank. Lin was the name of the loyal maid assigned by the palace to the protagonist in the book, the one who stayed by her side until the bitter end. This couldn't be real. Steeling herself, she asked the question she dreaded. "Then I am Princess Shola of Kandari?" "Yes! Yes, you are!" Lin clapped her hands and bounced with childlike glee. But Shola didn't share her enthusiasm. If this was real, and she had somehow been transported into the book she was reading, then what awaited her was not heaven. It was a nightmare. Later, after speaking further with Lin, Shola learned that today was the day she was to be betrothed to the crown prince. Panic crept in. She knew she couldn't marry him, but she had no idea how to escape this world and return to her own. Ending her life wasn't an option. It was too drastic, too painful, and there was no guarantee it would work. For now, her best chance was to survive and play along. After much deliberation, Shola decided to take a risk. She wrote a letter and entrusted Lin to deliver it in secret. Though terrified when she saw the name on the letter, Lin agreed to carry out the task. Later that day, Shola was summoned to the imperial study. The emperor sat behind a grand desk, his presence commanding. Nearby, the crown prince stood with a reserved, detached expression. "Princess Shola," the emperor began, "I trust you have enjoyed your stay with us these past few months. I see you are adapting well to our customs." "Yes, Your Majesty," Shola replied. "Thank you for your hospitality." Hospitality, indeed. Since her arrival, she had endured harsh daily lessons designed to prepare her for marriage into the royal family. Her Kandari clothing and jewelry had been confiscated without her consent. Although Shola felt little personal attachment to those items, she couldn't help but feel sympathy for the original protagonist. The conversation continued with polite formalities, the emperor detailing the terms of the trade agreement that would unite their kingdoms. Then, just as he was about to announce her betrothal to the crown prince, Shola spoke up. "Your Majesty, if I may," she interjected, "I believe it is necessary to add one clause to the agreement." The emperor raised an eyebrow. "And what might that be?" "I would like to be granted the freedom to choose my own husband." The emperor nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He was certain she would choose the crown prince. What he didn't know was that Shola had no intention of following the path laid out for her in the book. She remembered all too well how the original princess had willingly accepted her fate, even agreeing to become the prince's concubine, since foreign women were forbidden from becoming empress. That decision had allowed the crown prince to manipulate the trade agreement entirely in his favor, leaving her kingdom with nothing. Shola wasn't about to let history or fiction repeat itself. Princess Shola and the emperor both sealed the agreement with their respective seals. The emperor then asked, "Have you considered who you would like to be betrothed to?" Shola nodded firmly. "Prince Yun," she replied. The emperor and the crown prince froze, visibly shocked. Prince Yun was an enigma within the royal family. His mother, a low-ranking concubine, had passed away shortly after his birth, leaving him to navigate the brutal reality of palace life on his own. Hardened by these experiences, Prince Yun had become a man of few words, known for his cold demeanor and ruthless military discipline. His distance from court politics, coupled with the immense military power he wielded, made both the emperor and the crown prince wary of him. The crown prince was the first to speak, his voice laced with disbelief. "Prince Yun? Long Yun? Surely you must be mistaken. That brother of mine spends more time on the battlefield than in the capital. He has nothing to offer you. I thought you—" Shola interrupted before he could finish. "Respectfully, Your Highness, he is the husband I have chosen." The emperor, attempting to regain control of the situation, said cautiously, "Prince Yun is a man who has always valued his freedom. It's unlikely he would agree to this marriage." Shola met his gaze steadily. "Then let us summon him and ask his opinion." Prince Yun was summoned without delay. His cold, calculating eyes swept over the room as he entered. "You sent for me, father?" he asked, his tone icy. "Yes," the emperor replied. "You are, of course, aware of Princess Shola. She has expressed a wish to be betrothed to you. What is your response?" Prince Yun's gaze shifted to Shola as he studied her briefly. Finally, he turned back to the emperor. "I suppose I do need a wife. I accept." The disbelief on the faces of the emperor and crown prince was almost comical, and it took all of Shola's willpower to suppress her laughter. Left with no other choice, the emperor issued a decree for their wedding to take place the following month. As they exited the imperial study, Prince Yun walked beside Shola, his expression unreadable. "Princess," he began, his tone sharp, "rumor has it that you're in love with the crown prince. So you can imagine my surprise when I received your letter. Why the sudden change of heart?" Shola met his gaze, her voice calm. "I simply thought things through. Rather than fighting an entire harem of women for the attention of a man who doesn't care about me, why not choose a quiet and free life?" For the first time, Prince Yun smiled, a small, amused smile that softened his cold exterior. Shola continued, her tone serious. As I mentioned in my letter, let me remind you, this is a strategic alliance. We won't be romantically involved. Once the trade stabilizes in a few years and relations between our kingdoms are secure, we can part ways amicably. Prince Yun's smile widened into a sly grin. Relax, princess. We'll be fine as long as you don't fall in love with me. I won't, she said emphatically, clenching her fists to resist the temptation to punch him. They reached an agreement, a marriage that would grant Shola authority over inter-kingdom trade while shielding Yun from the emperor and Crown Prince's attempts to force him into a politically advantageous union. After Prince Yun left, Lin approached Shola, her voice trembling with concern. Oh, princess! Of all people, why would you choose Prince Yun? Shola simply smiled to herself, offering no answer. She had chosen him not just because he was a decent man, but because she knew what fate awaited him. According to the book, Prince Yun's life would soon end in tragedy. In the next war, the Crown Prince would orchestrate a delay in military provisions, causing Yun and his men to starve and be annihilated by the enemy. He would then send reinforcements, feign grief for the loss of his brother, and honor Prince Yun as a hero who sacrificed himself for the nation. As the widow of a hero, Shola would gain her freedom, along with wealth and status, until she could find a way back to her own world. Yet, as she replayed Yun's faint smile in her mind, a pang of guilt stirred in her heart. She quickly dismissed it. None of this was real. These were just characters in a story. Her survival was all that mattered. The wedding day arrived. Shola was dressed in a red wedding robe, adorned with intricate gold embroidery, her face concealed by a matching red veil. As the wedding procession drew near, Shola glanced around. Aside from two Kandari envoys, there were no familiar faces present to witness the ceremony. Even they would depart as soon as the wedding concluded and the trade agreements were finalized. The life of the protagonist in the original story was indeed a pitiful one. Through the veil, Shola's gaze settled on Prince Yun. He sat astride his horse, dressed in a red wedding robe embroidered with gold to match hers. She reminded herself that this was not the original story. She had chosen a different path. Prince Yun dismounted and approached, offering his hand to help her into the red wedding sedan. After she got in, the sedan was carried by 4 men. Yun returned to his horse, and they set off for his manor. Despite Prince Yun's usual preference for simplicity, the wedding banquet was a grand affair, a symbol of the alliance between their kingdoms. Nobles and members of the royal family came to offer their congratulations. However, the crown prince was absent. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, Shola found herself in the wedding chamber alone with Prince Yun. The room was beautiful and lavishly decorated in red, but an awkward silence stretched between them. Finally, Prince Yun broke the stillness. "Give me your hand," he said. Shola hesitated, unsure of his intentions, but extended her hand. To her surprise, he slipped a red beaded bracelet onto her wrist. She recognized it as a traditional Kandari bracelet. "Where did you get this?" she asked, startled. "I had your confiscated belongings retrieved from the palace," Prince Yun explained. "You can ask the steward for the rest tomorrow, but I thought you should have something to remind you of home today." Shola was momentarily speechless. The bracelet didn't truly remind her of home, given that she wasn't really the Kandari princess, but she couldn't deny the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Looking away to mask her emotions, she muttered, "You didn't have to. It's not a real wedding anyway." Prince Yun turned her gently to face him. "Princess," he said softly, "even if we're just partners, as long as you are officially my wife, it is my duty to protect you and care for you. We may not have feelings for each other, but I don't want to see you unhappy." So that was it, Shola thought. He must have assumed she felt lonely or sad being married so far from her homeland. She smiled faintly and said, "Thank you." Her gratitude prompted a smile from Prince Yun, and he added, "You know, I never got to see you in a Kandari attire. I'm sure you would look beautiful. I hope to see it sometime." For a moment, his gaze lingered on her face, as though truly seeing her for the first time. A blush crept up Shola's cheeks, and Prince Yun quickly stepped back. I can sleep on the floor tonight," he offered, moving to gather bedding. You should take the bed. Shola shook her head. I don't mind sharing the bed. It's big enough for both of us. Prince Yun hesitated, but eventually nodded, settling onto the bed at a respectful distance. Exhausted from the day's events, they both drifted to sleep shortly after. Shola woke up to find the bed empty. Turning over, she spotted Prince Yun sitting on the floor, wrapped in a blanket and gazing at her with tired eyes. What happened? She asked, puzzled. Why are you on the floor? I thought we agreed it was fine to share the bed. Prince Yun let out a weary sigh as he stood and stretched. I got tired of battling for the blanket and being kicked by my dear wife in the middle of the night. Shola's eyes widened in embarrassment, her hands flying to cover her mouth. She had completely forgotten about her habit of tossing and turning in her sleep. Yun smirked at her flustered expression. Don't worry, we've got many days ahead of us. I'll get used to it. With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Shola staring after him. What was wrong with this man? He always said the most infuriating things. No sooner had he left than a group of maids entered, bowing deeply before helping her prepare for the day. Shola found the experience overwhelming. She wasn't used to being served by so many people at once. She missed Lin's familiar presence. The palace attendants hadn't allowed Lin to accompany her, claiming she was specifically trained to serve within the palace. Perhaps Yun could help. Once the maids were done, she asked where to find him and quickly dismissed them. Shola made her way to the manor's training grounds, where she found Yun, shirtless, practicing his sword technique. His movements were fluid and precise, and she stood transfixed watching him until he suddenly stopped and turned toward her. Enjoying the view, princess? He teased, a sly grin spreading across his face. Shola snapped back to her senses. He clearly enjoyed teasing her, but she refused to be rattled this time. Marching up to him, she met his gaze squarely. You're my husband. I can stare at you as much as I want. Yun raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by her boldness. I see someone's feeling braver today. Be careful, princess, or you might actually fall in love with me. Shola scoffed. You wish. She continued in a serious tone, explaining her discomfort with the number of servants constantly around her. She would rather have just Lin by her side. Yun initially objected, insisting that it was his responsibility to provide her with the respect befitting her status. But Shola pressed until he reluctantly agreed. As Shola turned to leave, Yun called out, an amused glint in his eyes. One more thing. Now that we're married, don't you think you should call me something else? It might sound odd to others if you keep calling me Prince Yun. He stepped closer, a playful smile tugging at his lips. How about Long Yun, or just Yun, or maybe my husband? I could call you my lady in return. Shola rolled her eyes. Shola will do just fine. Without waiting for a reply, she hurried away. Yun watched her retreat with a chuckle, but then his laughter faded. What was he doing? He was starting to enjoy her company more than he should. Shaking off the thought, he returned to his training. That afternoon, a knock came at Shola's door. She opened it to find Lin standing there, beaming. Mistress, I'm so glad to see you again. Shola's face lit up as she embraced Lin, surprising the girl who was unused to such informality between mistress and servant. I didn't think you'd arrive so soon, Shola said, pulling back. Lin explained. Prince Yun went to the palace himself to request permission for me to join you. Her eyes twinkled with mischief. His Highness must care for you deeply, mistress. Shola was caught off guard, unable to come up with a witty response. She knew how much Yun disliked the palace. For him to make the trip personally, it meant more than she wanted to admit. Later that night, as Shola sat alone in the room, a storm of emotions brewed within her. It was becoming harder to convince herself that none of this was real. Prince Yun came into the room, and when he saw her, he gave her one of his usual boyish smiles, making her heart flutter. Yun held a small box in his hands, which he handed to her. It contained the keys to the manor's warehouse and treasury. He was essentially giving her control over his manor. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Prince Yoon gave her a tired but sincere look. "You don't seem convinced that I intend to take our partnership seriously. I've told you before, as long as we're married, you'll have all the privileges of a prince's wife." He moved closer, gently taking her hands in his. "Shola," he said, his tone unusually soft. "I'm not the most likable person, but I always keep my promises. Always." Her throat tightened as she nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Who told him he wasn't likable? She glanced down at her hands, which felt small, but warm in his. For some reason, she didn't feel uncomfortable with him this close. She felt safe. Yoon gave her shoulder a reassuring pat, saying he would sleep in his study that night, and left. She was grateful for the space because she needed time to think. Shola's thoughts were a tangled mess. How did it come to this? She shouldn't be feeling anything for a character in a book. Yet, the knowledge of Yoon's impending fate was something she could no longer bear. Then a thought struck. In the book, Yoon's death had been due to the delay of critical military food supplies. What if she could change that? If the army received their supplies in time, Yoon and his men might stand a chance. But she needed money, and quickly. She had managed to retain control over the Kandari trade, and would earn commissions from incoming shipments. But the first shipment was months away. Even then, the profit wouldn't be enough to feed a mid-sized army. Time wasn't on her side. A memory from the book came to her rescue. Liquid perfumes from Persia were in high demand among noblewomen, but were notoriously expensive and hard to acquire. Shola formulated a plan. If she could create and sell high-quality liquid perfumes locally, she'd corner the market. By pricing them just below the usual cost, she could make a fortune without incurring shipping expenses. She summoned the steward and instructed him to gather the materials and staff she would need. She also instructed him to purchase land in a particular province and employ workers to begin cultivating it immediately. The steward, though bewildered, complied. After all, Prince Yoon had granted her complete control of the manor's resources. The next day, Shola wasted no time. She purchased a spacious shop with a workshop in the back and enlisted a team of maids from the manor, ones she had previously dismissed from her chambers. Their loyalty to Yoon would ensure the perfume formulas remained a secret, at least for a while. Everyone got to work, and the opening date was scheduled for just a few weeks away. Shola was hardly ever at home. She was working tirelessly to set up the perfumery. Prince Yoon was equally busy with training his army, and their paths rarely crossed, even at night. On the evening before the store's grand opening, Shola stayed out late to finalize preparations. As she was wrapping up for the night, her maid, Lin, informed her that Prince Yoon had come to escort her home. When Shola stepped outside, she found him waiting. "Why did you come? I was just about to head home," she said, surprised. Prince Yoon didn't respond. Instead, he took her hand, and they walked the short distance home in companionable silence. Back in their room, Shola noticed a small paper bag on the table. Curious, she peeked inside and gasped. "These are my favorite snacks. How did you know?" Yoon finally smiled softly. "You eat them almost every day. It would be strange if I didn't notice." Shola beamed as she sat down to enjoy the treat. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched. Yoon took a seat next to her, his gaze warm as he watched her. "Is there something on your mind?" Shola asked. "You were awfully quiet on the way home." Yoon hesitated. "It's nothing," he said, looking away briefly. "It's just, we've both been so busy these past few weeks, and the house has been really quiet." Shola couldn't resist teasing him. "What? Did you miss me?" Yoon met her eyes, his expression serious. "Yes, I did." Shola almost choked on her dessert. She had meant it as a joke, but the sincerity in his voice and the intensity in his eyes caught her completely off guard. Flustered, she quickly stood up. "I should get some rest. The store opens early tomorrow," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. Later, as she lay in bed with her eyes closed, she could feel Yoon's gaze as he lay next to her. How was she supposed to sleep under such scrutiny? Yet, exhaustion soon overtook her, and she fell asleep. Yoon, however, remained awake, deep in thought. He had come so close to confessing how his feelings for her had changed. The past few weeks without seeing her, the house had felt lifeless, and the days seemed so bland. He wondered what he had done before she came along. But he doubted Shola felt the same way. How could he get her to see him as more than just an ally? Just then, Shola stirred in her sleep. She rolled over, draping an arm across his chest. Yun froze, his heart pounding. He gently tried to move her arm, but she instinctively returned to the same position. Resigned, he wrapped an arm around her and held her close. At that moment, he wished time would stop. Soon, he too fell asleep. The next morning, Shola woke to the sound of Yun's voice. "Shola, wake up! You're going to be late for the store opening." Groggily, she opened her eyes, only to realize her head was resting on Yun's chest. She shot up, startled, her face flushing with embarrassment. Yun was watching her with his usual grin and that same look in his eyes from the night before. "What happened? How did I?" Shola stammered. Unable to finish the question, Yun sat up with an amused smirk. "Well, my dear wife, you were very determined to stay cuddled in my arms last night. I had no choice but to sacrifice myself for your comfort." Shola groaned inwardly. She must have been moving around in her sleep again. Mortified, she pushed past him, muttering something about needing to get ready, and fled the room. Yun stayed behind, staring at the now empty space with a wistful smile. Enough of this, he thought. It was time to tell her how he truly felt. Between his precarious position as an unfavored prince, the brewing tensions on the border, and his strained relationships with the emperor and crown prince, he could not see why she would commit to a life with him. But that decision would be hers to make. News of the local perfumery spread like wildfire throughout the capital, and noblewomen rushed to buy the first batch before it sold out. Shola's shop sold out on the first day and continued to do so every day during the opening week. 2 months later, her perfumes were being used in nearly every noble house. She even created affordable, lighter scents for commoners. When the crown prince heard about the success of the shop, he was furious. He had assumed he had more time before the first Kandari shipment arrived to devise a plan to reclaim control from Prince Yun and Shola. But now, to his shock, she had managed to establish herself as the owner of the only local perfumery. In time, Prince Yun's mansion could accumulate enough wealth to rival even the top merchants. If he had known how resourceful she was, he would have fought harder to marry her. It was time for him to invite Princess Shola for a serious conversation. Days later, as Shola walked to the store with Lin, a group of masked men cornered them, knocking Lin unconscious and kidnapping Shola. When she awoke, she found herself in an old, abandoned house, with the crown prince sitting across from her. "Princess, I apologize for the poor reception, but you must understand that under the circumstances, I had no choice," he said coldly. Shola didn't have the patience for games. "What do you want?" He offered her a deal. If she confessed to the emperor that Yun was plotting treason, he would marry her as a concubine and give her partial control of the Kandari trade. "You will be the future emperor's woman," he said, his tone boastful. Shola corrected him. "You mean one of the future emperor's many women." "No, thank you." He had no idea that Yun had already given her full control over the trade. The crown prince's face darkened with rage at her rejection. He pressed a dagger to her throat. "Do not test my patience, princess," he threatened. The blade sank into her skin just slightly, drawing a trickle of blood. Just then, the door burst open, and Yun, accompanied by his men, stormed in. The crown prince was no match for Yun and was disarmed with ease. "How dare you kidnap my wife?" Yun growled, fury in his voice. "You must be tired of living." The crown prince sneered. "How do you know she doesn't want to be with me? Surely you've heard the rumors." Yun lost his temper and lunged at the crown prince, but Shola quickly grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Don't hurt him," she pleaded. Yun turned to her, hurt and confusion flickering in his eyes. He hesitated for a moment before ordering his men to withdraw. He then turned to the crown prince with a cold, steely gaze. "If you ever lay a hand on my wife again, I'll assume you no longer need those hands. Gone was the playful Yun that Shola was accustomed to. Now he was in his absolute military element, powerful, commanding, and unforgiving. He grabbed Shola's hand and led her out the door, gently placing her on his horse before riding back home. Once there, he carried her in his arms to the room, despite her insistence that she could walk on her own. Inside, he retrieved some medicine and began treating the knife wound on her neck. "Is Lin okay?" Shola asked softly. "She's fine. We found her," Yun replied, his tone stiff. "Are you upset with me?" Shola asked, sensing the tension. "What right do I have to be upset?" Yun responded, his anger bubbling over. "After all, we're just allies, right? When I heard you were kidnapped, I nearly lost my mind, riding like a madman to get to you in time. And in the end, you chose to protect that scoundrel." Yun turned away in frustration. "If you care about him so much, why didn't you just marry him? Why marry me? Why come into my life and make me feel all these things for you?" Shola wasn't sure whether to be moved by his words or upset at how deeply he misunderstood her. She hugged from behind, surprising him. "Yun, I wasn't trying to protect him. I was protecting you. The Emperor is already suspicious of you, and most of the officials are looking for an excuse to get rid of you. If you hurt the Crown Prince now, who knows what crime they might accuse you of? I don't want to lose you." Yun's anger melted away as he turned and gazed into her eyes. He pulled her into a tight embrace. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have gotten mad at you. I should have known you were looking at the bigger picture. And if I had protected you properly, you wouldn't have been kidnapped. It's okay, you came in time," Shola said, patting his back. They stayed like that for a while, and then Yun gently cupped her face in his hands. "Shola, I think I'll have to break our agreement. We agreed to just be allies and not have feelings for each other. But I've failed terribly. I've fallen in love with you, and I'm not sorry about it." Shola's heart raced, her chest tightening. She tried to brush off his words as a joke, searching for an excuse to get away. But Yun's grip was strong, and he held her gaze, unwilling to let her look away. "I'm not joking, Shola," he said, his voice steady. "I mean every word. If you're willing to truly become my wife, it would make me the happiest man alive. But even if you don't feel the same way, my initial promise to you still stands. As long as we're married, you will have the respect and protection a prince's wife deserves." Shola remained quiet, her heart in turmoil. Of course, she cared about him. Why else would she be working so hard to keep him alive? But how could she give her heart to him when she didn't know when, or if, she would ever return home? Seeing that she remained silent, Yun said softly, "All this must be a lot to take in. I'll sleep in the study tonight and let you think about it. Good night, my lady." He placed a gentle kiss on her forehead and turned to leave, but Shola suddenly pulled him close for a brief, tender kiss. Startled, Yun blinked in surprise. "Does that mean what I think it means?" Shola leaned in, whispering in his ear. "Yes, my dear husband." Yun felt as if he were dreaming, but then Shola kissed him lightly again, as if to reassure him. This time, Yun kissed her back, deepening the kiss until they were both breathless. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he said with a gleam in his eyes. Shola couldn't help but laugh. "So, my dear wife, would you like me to stay tonight?" Yun asked, still holding her close. Shola rested her head on his chest, her voice soft. "I wouldn't mind." Yun carried her to the bed, and that night, she truly became his wife. The next morning, Shola woke in Yun's embrace. This time, instead of pulling away, she snuggled closer. Soon, Lin's voice called from outside the door. "Your Highness, my lady, there is someone here from the palace. His Majesty has sent for Prince Yun." Yun sat up slowly. He said to Shola, "I'll go see my father and be back as soon as I can." He pressed a quick kiss to her forehead before getting up to prepare. Shola mustered a smile as he left, but unease rippled through her. She stayed home that day, letting someone else manage the store. When Yun returned later that afternoon, his carefree attitude was gone. He reached for her hands, and the moment his gaze met hers, she knew what he was about to say. "There was an attack on our border," Yun began. "The cities in the Linzhou province are in danger, and His Majesty has asked me to lead an army to push back the enemy." Shola swallowed hard, trying to suppress the wave of fear rising within her. She reminded herself of the plans she had put in place. Still, the dread remained. Yoon placed his hands gently on her face, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I've fought them off before, and this time won't be any different. I'll be back before you know it." She nodded, forcing a smile. "When do you leave?" "Tonight," Yoon replied. "I'll head to the camp and march with the army in the morning." So soon. Shola rose to help Yoon pack, putting together everything she felt he would need, while he changed into his military attire. Once he was ready, she excused herself and returned wearing one of the traditional Kandari outfits he had recovered from the palace. When Yoon saw her, he froze, his breath catching. "You look beautiful, my darling." She smiled softly. "You look dashing as well. I thought I'd give you a little surprise before you leave. You once said you'd like to see me dressed like this. When you return, I'll dress this way as often as you want." Yoon pulled her into a tight embrace, his lips brushing hers in a tender kiss. "I'll hold you to that," he whispered, his voice laced with emotion. As they stepped outside, Yoon mounted his horse, his gaze lingering on her. Shola called out, her voice trembling. "Yoon, don't forget to write to me, and please, come back to me safe." He grinned, that boyish charm momentarily breaking through the somber atmosphere. "I will, I promise." With one final glance, he turned and rode toward the camp. Shola remained standing by the gate until Lin approached, her voice soft. "Mistress, please don't cry. His Highness will return." Cry? It was only then Shola realized there were tears streaming down her face. She wiped them away. Yoon would be fine. She would ensure it. The next morning, at the perfumery, Shola summoned her accountant. She instructed him to begin exchanging their profits for dry grain, but to do so discreetly, purchasing in small batches so as not to draw attention. The war dragged on for a month, and true to his word, Yoon wrote to Shola every single day, updating her on the progress of the battles. His most recent letter brought the news Shola had been anxiously awaiting. Yoon's army was on the brink of victory, successfully driving back the enemy forces. Although they were a little low on food and essential supplies, Yoon had already requested provisions from the court and expected their arrival soon. But Shola knew better. The supplies would not come in time. The crown prince had deliberately delayed them, hoping Yoon and his army would perish. The emperor, eager to diminish Yoon's military influence, would turn a blind eye to this. She was the only one who could save him. 2 weeks later, Yoon sat in his tent at the military camp, brooding over the situation. The army's supplies were dwindling, barely enough to last a couple more weeks. He knew the court wanted to get rid of him, but he hadn't anticipated that they would risk the lives of the people in Linzhou just to see him dead. In his recent letters to Shola, he hadn't told her how bad the situation had gotten, so she wouldn't be worried, how he missed her. A soldier interrupted his thoughts, announcing that someone from his manor was there to see him. Curious, Yoon nodded for them to enter. When he looked up, his breath caught. Standing at the entrance to his tent, smiling brightly, was Shola. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating until she teased, "What? Didn't you miss me?" Yoon closed the distance, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around in joy. "Shola, is it really you? What are you doing here?" Laughing, Shola took his hand and said, "I have a surprise for you." She led him outside, where rows of carts brimming with supplies awaited. Grain and other necessities piled high. Shola explained how she had used the profits from her business to purchase the grain, but that wasn't all. She revealed that months earlier, she had bought acres of farmland and livestock just outside the nearby city. The produce from those fields, combined with the grain she'd brought, would sustain the army for at least 2 months. Yoon stood speechless, trying to comprehend it all. How had she known about the supply delays, or even where and when this war would take place? The questions swirled in his mind. But before he could voice them, Shola said softly, "I don't know how to explain how I knew, but you need to know that I will always be on your side." Yoon's hand tightened around hers as he said, "I know, I trust you." Relief washed over Shola, seeing that Yoon chose not to press further. Though Yoon insisted on assigning guards to escort Shola safely back home, she adamantly refused. "I'll stay in the nearby city," she said. "That way, we can see each other often." After much hesitation, Yoon relented. He couldn't deny the comfort of having her close, even amid the chaos of war. The war went on for another month, but despite the lack of reinforcements, Yoon managed to drive back the enemy forces and reclaim lost territory. news of his victory quickly spread to the capital, where the citizens marveled at Prince Yun's brilliance on the battlefield. Whispers began circulating that Yun, not the crown prince, might be more suited to ascend the throne. When the crown prince heard of these rumors, a wave of panic gripped him. Feeling his position threatened, he resolved to bring Yun down as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Yun and Shola spent their days in relative peace, enjoying each other's company while working to help the city and its displaced citizens recover from the war's devastation. Just as things were settling down, an edict arrived from the capital. Prince Yun was ordered to return and deliver a report on the war to the emperor, with the promise of a reward for his victory. Yun found the timing unusual. His last orders had clearly instructed him to remain at the border, but he brushed aside his doubts and prepared for the journey. The next day, Yun departed with Shola and a group of his most loyal soldiers. As soon as they ventured beyond Linzhou province, they were ambushed by the crown prince and a battalion of soldiers. The crown prince stepped forward, accusing Yun of abandoning his post without authorization, a grave offense punishable by death. Yun produced the edict summoning him to the capital, but the crown prince dismissed it as a forgery and added the charge of falsifying an imperial order. "You've committed treason, brother," the crown prince sneered, his tone laced with malice. Without warning, the crown prince ordered his soldiers to attack. Chaos erupted as Yun's men fought valiantly. Yun turned to Shola, urging her to flee on horseback with some soldiers while he held the battalion off. But she stood firm, her voice resolute. "I won't leave you. Don't even try to make me." Seeing the determination in her eyes, Yun relented and mounted the horse with her. Rallying his soldiers, he led an effort to break through the enemy's lines, hoping to reach the safety of Linzhou. If they could make it back to the city, Yun knew he had the forces to hold their ground, at least temporarily. While he formulated a plan, spotting a gap in the enemy formation, Yun seized the moment. With Shola holding tightly to him, he spurred the horse into a desperate gallop. His only thought was to ensure Shola's safety. As Linzhou's gates came into view, a sharp whistle cut through the air. An arrow struck Yun in the side, tearing through his armor. The shot had come from the crown prince. Yun's grip on the reins faltered as pain coursed through him. "Yun, you're hurt!" Shola exclaimed, her voice quivering with fear. "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth, though his ragged breaths betrayed his words. The city gates loomed closer, but Yun's strength was fading rapidly. He leaned heavily against Shola, his vision blurring. Shola shouted desperately to the guards to open the gates. Recognizing their wounded prince, the city's soldiers sprang into action, throwing the gates wide and closing ranks to repel the crown prince's battalion, till the gates were safely shut again. As they crossed into the safety of Linzhou, Yun slumped forward, unconscious. Shola cried out, panic gripping her. "Someone get a doctor! Now!" Yun was rushed to the governor's manor, his loyal soldiers forming a protective barrier around the building. Outside, the city's soldiers braced themselves as the crown prince's forces pressed forward, determined to breach the gates. Inside the governor's manor, Shola stayed by Yun's side as doctors and healers worked tirelessly to save him. They managed to stop the bleeding and dress his wound, but their faces were grim as they emerged from the room. One of them approached Shola, speaking softly. "The arrow struck vital organs, and he's lost too much blood. There's nothing more we can do." Their words felt like a knife to her heart. They left the room, leaving her alone with Yun. Shola clutched his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. His breathing was shallow, his complexion pale, yet he managed a faint, reassuring smile. "I couldn't save you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why couldn't I save you? After everything we've been through? Why is the end still the same?" Yun's weak fingers moved with great effort to wipe away her tears. "Shola," he said, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "The crown prince wants my life, not yours. If you go with him, he won't harm you, for the sake of the alliance. As long as you're safe, I'll die with no regrets." Shola shook her head fiercely. "You can't leave me. Not now. Not like this. I love you." His dim eyes brightened for a fleeting moment. "I love you too, my darling," he whispered. "I know I promised I'd come back to you safe, but it seems I'll have to break that promise too." Yoon's gaze lingered on her face, as if committing every detail to memory. Then his hand slipped from her grip, falling limply to his side, and his chest stilled. "No!" Shola screamed, shaking him as if sheer will could bring him back. She collapsed next to him, her cries echoing through the room and drowning out the distant clamor of soldiers scrambling to fortify the city. Grief consumed her, the weight of it pressing down on her. The sounds of battle outside became muffled, like she was submerged underwater. Her chest tightened, her vision dimmed, and finally, everything went black. When Shola opened her eyes again, she was greeted by bright fluorescent lights. The hum of machinery filled the air. She blinked, disoriented, and realized she was lying in a hospital bed. Her pillow was damp with tears, her body trembling. The vivid memory of Yoon's final moments haunted her, the pain fresh and raw. A nurse entered the room, her expression kind. "You're awake! How are you feeling?" Shola didn't answer. She was still trying to make sense of her surroundings. "You were hit by a truck while crossing the road," the nurse explained gently. "Fortunately, the driver slowed down in time. The impact wasn't fatal, but you've been unconscious for days." Doctors arrived shortly after to check her vitals, their voices distant and formal. When they left, Shola closed her eyes, tears flowing silently. Was it all just a dream? No, it couldn't have been. Yoon was more real to her than anyone she had ever known. Over the next few days, her body began to recover, but her mind remained trapped in Linso. Friends and colleagues visited her, offering support, but their words were a blur. 2 weeks later, she was discharged from the hospital. She returned to her routine, trying to rediscover herself as Shola the translator, not Princess Shola, the wife of Prince Yoon. She received a call from her agent, who informed her that the author of the book had regained consciousness 2 weeks ago and was ready to discuss the story, though she wanted nothing more than to leave it all behind. She resolved to meet him, if only to confront him and demand answers about why he had written such a tragic ending. As she sat in the coffee shop, waiting, the door opened and the author walked in. "Miss Shola, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," he said warmly. Her coffee cup slipped from her grasp, shattering on the floor as she froze in shock. He looked exactly like Yoon. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked with concern. "I'm Long Yoon, the author." Her eyes welled with tears. He seemed so distant. This couldn't be her Yoon. "I'm sorry," she managed, her voice trembling. "You look like someone I know." Suddenly, he smiled, a familiar, boyish grin that tugged at her heart. "Then I wonder if you miss him as much as he misses you," he said softly. Shola's breath hitched. That look in his eyes. It was Yoon. He opened his arms wide, and she flew into them, sobbing uncontrollably as all the emotions she had suppressed came rushing to the surface. "It's okay, my love. I came back like I promised," Yoon whispered, tears streaking down his own face. They clung to each other, oblivious to the stares of other patrons, until a waitress approached a little upset. "Excuse me, but you're disturbing the other guests." Embarrassed, they quickly apologized, paid the bill, and left the coffee shop. Outside, they found a quiet park bench, and Yoon began to explain. "When I woke up from the coma, I had all the memories of our time together," he said. "But I convinced myself it was just a vivid dream, until I saw you today." Shola looked at him, her heart still racing from disbelief. "But why did you write such a heartbreaking story? Why give your name to a side character who dies so tragically?" Yoon's expression turned somber, because, like Prince Yoon, I lost my mother as a child. My father remarried, and my relationship with him and my stepbrother deteriorated over time. The world felt like a dark and lonely place to me. Tragic stories were all I knew how to write. But meeting you has taught me how to love again and see the beauty in life. Shola took his hands in hers, her voice firm but tender. "You're not alone anymore, Yoon. You have me. I'm your family now." He smiled, his eyes glistening. "Then, will you be my wife once again?" "I already am," Shola replied, beaming with joy. He pulled her into an embrace, and they stayed there for hours, savoring the feeling of being reunited. 3 months later, Yoon's book was released in both Mandarin and English. The story had been rewritten to give Prince Yoon and Princess Shola the happy ending they deserved. In the present, Yun made peace with his father and stepbrother. Not long after, he and Shola were married in a beautiful ceremony, surrounded by both their families. A year later, they welcomed twins, a boy and a girl, into their lives. Together, they spent their days writing beautiful stories and raising their children, cherishing every moment of their hard-earned happiness.